This raises a whole lot of important questions now about the way people experience technology. I mean, I know, it's a banal example, but let's say I sit down in my living room, there's a television on, and I can't even get my kids to watch television anymore. So we'll say, let's sit down and watch this film. And we'll sit down to watch the film, and I'll be looking at them, and they'll be on their iPads or iPhones, and I'll say, hey, watch television. We're supposed to watch television together. And it used to be, can't we all sit down and have dinner together? Now it's, can't we all watch television together? And,
well, your grandfather asking you to sit by the fireplace.
Yeah, no, I seem to be like an old curmudgeon. But no, it really does raise questions of how aware of the space and how much in a space is anybody at any time, and how do all of these lessons from the 90s play out today. So, I mean, maybe to jump a little bit ahead, I'm looking at this work now and thinking now, 15 or 20 years later, where we're at. What do you guys think about where architecture plugs into these discussions?
Yeah.
And also, why is architecture so absent from these discussions?
And why has it become so boring?
Which?
Architecture. Okay. Honestly, no, what's interesting is that, and Mark and I were just talking about this before I got up here, is that in this period, and the reason I start out by saying we had this kind of kids in a candy store thing, we were kind of at the right age, right? In our, what we were then, sort of somewhere between late 20s and mid 30s.
15 years younger than we are now.
Yeah. and the kind of, we were at that moment in our careers where we were still kind of, we could experiment. We weren't really tied to, big practices or whatever. We had a lot of sort of freedom, let's say, right? And all of a sudden the tools changed radically. And I remember, like that story I told of Tom and Eric, it was a radical rupture to have those tools at our disposal. So I think that there was an interesting kind of perfect storm, right, of a generation of frustrated and young radical architects who were dealing with these tools, looking at the art world, looking at the world of philosophy or other areas, mathematics, and then sort of coming together and then producing these kind of crazy, what you see in the show here. All these projects are kind of crazy breaks, right, ruptures. Since then, there's been, well, of course, then there was, of course, the 9/11 situation and the dot-com crash, the Lehman crash in 2008. So there's been a number of sort of things that have taken the wind out of the sails, let's say, of sort of the advances in technologies. It all went to social networking, for example, a lot of it, right? A lot of the innovation. So the thing that really amazed me, and the other day when Google bought those goggles, right, at $3.5 billion, whatever it was, I remember taking those guys from that New York Stock Exchange to SIGGRAPH in 91, 96, having them put on Cybernaut headsets. There was a company called Cybernaut, and they flipped out. They were like, this is too much for us. We can't put them down on the table. So no, we want to look at monitors. And at that time it was CRT monitors, not even flat screens. And so that kind of, that we were like so hungry we actually wanted them to do retina scanning technology. We wanted to actually laser into their eye, the back of their eyes, the New York Stock Exchange, so they would be, completely immersed. But that was the kind of naivete, but at the same time the kind of exuberance that we had. So I wondered today, and we both teach in a number of schools, and I'm constantly wondering if, in fact, that hunger, that desire, and that kind of need to experiment is not as heightened at the moment for whatever reason. I don't know what it is. Now, whether it's got something to do with the fact that we're in a different kind of lull with all the multitasking and social networking and the kind of what the virtual existence has become in terms of social spheres, right? Or it's another kind of quiet before the storm. And we may see a kind of, revival of much of this stuff. And hopefully architects are back in the trenches and they take the risks to get there. Because, the other thing that should be noted, I don't know about you, and I'm sure you did, we got a lot of flack for doing the stock exchange back then. It wasn't sort of people didn't just say, oh yes, architects doing virtual reality makes perfect sense. It was the opposite. It was like, why are you guys doing this? What are you doing in this space? We had, kind of, email eggs thrown at us by architects when we ended up in architectural record with the project, or PA, or whatever it was. So it wasn't so, and in a way, walking into this room today, what amazes me about the show, the stuff is all still very radical. None of that work in there has become mainstream. So I'm interested in that. Bernard's maybe.
No, I mean, I think that'll teach these guys for not showing up, but we could talk about, no, I think we can talk about Bernard and Cox, but I think Bernard's has actually become very mainstream.
But no, it's true, yes, you're right. I didn't mean it that way, I meant the kind of, the research level.
Yeah, Bernard.
Well, I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because though he appeared in the fold as a sort of secret agenda of Deleuze, he was actually, architecturally, he was very traditional.
Yeah.
Because he talks about the frame, and Deleuze took that notion of the frame. So he is right, don't forget Euclid, right? That was Bernard's sort of, we all thought like Bernard is like going fully hardcore topological, but he said like, don't forget Euclid, right, for 20 years. Yeah. And I think that's a success, because that Zemprian separation of the tectonic and the ornament, that made it very successful. Because you look at like my stuff where there's no separation, where you like walk in the ornament, so to speak, right? I went there with an art historian, and he was like looking at these ripples coming from the sensors. He was like, Robert Adam. He was thinking like, that's ornament. And but then in a sort of another relationship. And I moved my position. I thought I sort of, well, for that project it was okay, but actually that notion of fascination, also critics comparing it to Wagnerian manipulation of crowds, the fact that they are these huge masses, the fact that people go berserk in the space, that they had to stop children from manipulating the sensors because they were going wild. I've seen a woman sit in a lotus like doing Zen meditation in the projections. I saw really weird stuff. And
this was Holland. This was Holland in that period.
No, she was Californian. and for her it was like acid, that whole building. And I was at a certain moment I was thinking maybe it is too close to fascination and immersion and to the sublime, and that it's not an accident that these masses go through so excited and so exalted, and maybe there is, and that's the Bernard. Yeah. I think, because I remember like finishing that project, and I was sitting by the phone for like half a year, because I thought now I get like 20 commissions, and I never got a phone call. Because that thing is so incredibly radical, and it's not like, can you build a water pavilion for us? Because it's like an extreme church. It is a very weird experience. And so I think the distance that Bernard creates.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
well,
let me ask you.
The fact that you can hang it in an elevator and in a bedroom makes it very successful.
No, but also connecting an algorithmic approach to a manufacturing approach.
Sure.
I mean, that's very much in a kind of, well, we asked them today. I mean, the maker culture, like the MakerBot culture.
Mass customization.
Wasn't there, but now it is here, and it's a very interesting relationship to Bernard, but also the whole approach to BIM. Bernard was also really thinking in terms of BIM. I mean, there's a conservative thing about it, about thinking like that. But I mean, that was really his vision.
There's another way that I kind of see the subtext, and maybe Lise-Anne can speak to this because of what our experience on the stock exchange, which is, I think part of the struggle at that time, coming out of POMO and decon and everything that was beginning to happen, was an intuition by a generation, by us and many others in our generation, that we needed to regain a kind of expertise and have a kind of position of being expert, right? Because what was beginning to happen is it was a kind of degradation of the architect into this sort of role of, which we see today. I mean, quite frankly, to sit in a room with a client who doesn't understand your expertise necessarily, right? Sees you as one of the number of so-called consultants, and you then, and if you kind of run a traditional firm, you have to kind of sublimate yourself to that and become, you can't show those stripes too much, right? Unless you do a kind of circus act, like a certain group in New York, which I won't mention, who does a kind of cup moving thing to say, no, we are experts and this is what we do, and therefore you have to listen to us. So I think that what you see in this exhibition is a real, I think, the subtext that I read, is a desire to regain a kind of traction as an architect and to say, yes, this is the kind of expertise we have and that we can employ.
To be more, I got you, but I got to ask you a more personal question.
Sure.
Because I know the New York Five, let's say,
Yeah.
and also, let's say, Dutch modernism. Those were very strong languages which held sway over a lot of where we were. And, you know, there were people that were second and third generation even taking that New York Five language and trying to refine it or divert it a little bit or do something with it. And the same thing in the Netherlands. It was this very monolithic notion of what a language would be.
Right.
How much was the digital a path to developing a language? And how much was the digital a way of breaking, let's say, with that New York Five or with the Dutch modernism for you three?
Well, I think it was more about a break rather than the creating was the outcome, but it started definitely with the break, which, you know, we came in at the tail end of decon, but it was really a fascination with trying to find a new form of expression that was inspired on the one hand with early avant-garde collagist methodologies in the late 60s and 70s, and then incorporating multimedia, which at the time, you know, was limited to photography, collage, video, always anticipating the ability to incorporate the motion graphics and so on, and the ability to work with complex geometries and animation in the computer. So I think that it was a way to try and escape, I think, the kind of weight of
there were
that history.
Yeah, there were two weights. There were two. There was that one, and there was the weight of a sense of being neutered as a profession. That we, I think, collectively kind of intuited was beginning to come down the pipe. And yes, there was all kinds of stylistic momentum and movement, and you could say, and you see it today. Honestly, the new Biennale, and for however it turns out, right? One has to ask the question, is that going to be, and I have a real question for that Biennale, right? I know this is being webcast, so if you're watching, my question is...
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Is, you know, I'm going to be kind of interested to see if the digital is at all anywhere
It's everywhere.
within this. No, not.
But
the
not as a
digital-
language.
Right, and not as a kind of research.
Language is gone.
Language is gone.
Sure, but the tools are there.
Oh, of course, the tools are
So
there.
you can do big triangles, you can do many triangles, you can do a few triangles, one curve, extruded curve, you can do all these.
You can take the radical out of the project, but you can't take the project
Of course.
out of the radical.
But I
So
think,
it's not in the tool itself.
but you know, Hani's earlier comment about architects regaining some kind of ground as being experts, and I think that one should be very careful to differentiate between being an expert and being a specialist. And I think that one of the things that we found incredibly liberating was to be able to suddenly regain some of the territory that architects have always been invested in, that's not just on a very straight and narrow understanding of building per se, but understanding the relationship of building to culture at large, to understanding an integrated idea of technology, you know, so that all of those projects in some way kind of go into other territories. So, you know, Lars, when you talk about taking over from the set designer, taking over from the experience designer, the exhibition designer, you know, even to a certain extent, fabrication and contractors, really thinking much more holistically. For us, it was very much the same thing. It was becoming somebody that could look very holistically, very broadly, from a 40,000-foot view, and then from an incredible amount of, you know, high level of detail simultaneously.
But so we got to open it up to the audience. But if you're right, then what happened? Because I think Hani's mentioning shop.
No, he didn't.
No, in shop.
I have to live in that city, so I have to be careful.
No, they're really interesting because they, you know, they started off. They used to advertise themselves as the developer-friendly Frank Gehry, which used to really upset me because Frank Gehry is the developer-friendly Frank Gehry. No, I mean actually, Frank really works on a budget and you know delivers project. So I thought that was slightly offensive, but they took that Gary Technologies model of BIM and really tried to push that expertise of project delivery, project development. I mean, they had a lot of dough with the Sharples to back them up to develop stuff. But they actually became this new kind of practice, which is very interesting and is about, engaging BIM, let's say. And I'll tell you that the exhibition coming down the pike really is dealing with that part of digital technology, which is the BIM part. But what happened with the media part? Because what I see in this show is so much contemporary relevance. I mean, if we walked Larry Page through the show, or we walked, people that are dealing with Apple stores through the show, they would say, wow, this is actually dealing with media in an environmental way, and this is interesting, and this would be relevant to a self-driving car, or Microsoft Home, or whatever those things would be. And architects aren't in that discussion anymore the way they were then. So what do you think happened?
I mean, I think that the profession, I have a lot of ideas what happened, and a lot of them I can't say while it's being, simulcast. But just to put it kind of carefully, the profession of architecture, in a strange way, was kind of the enemy to the kind of expertise that I'm talking about and where we were getting. It turned back into, honestly, that group, which I won't mention their name, but you did, and other groups like them that start with B and other letters, they have become they're not that different than the established firms with three letters, a lot of them, from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's just becoming, they just have new clothes on, and they've embraced technology they've embraced the business.
But didn't we see the same with Archigram becoming high-tech? I mean, if you look at the work of Peter Cook and Cedric Price and David Green, how cultural and radical they were and how little they built, and then compared to high-tech in the 70s, and then suddenly they take over all the clients of bankers and
No, it's true. When it went from
there's always the second phase, which is
but we didn't
not cultural.
But we didn't get to the first phase. That's the problem.
I think we were the first phase.
No, I know. But for example, the transition from the Pompidou to the Bank of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Okay, we didn't build the Pompidou yet. In other words,
tiny little Pompidou.
There's a lot of people doing
A wet one.
a little wet Pompidou.
A mini Pompidou.
Little wet.
No, but I think this whole discussion of media experience, who's responsible for bringing that into the public realm and spatializing it, it's an unfinished project, and frankly, I'm not worried about Jonathan Ive cracking the nut of what it's like to be in a media space, because Jonathan Ive doesn't have that in his wheelhouse. Sure. I mean, but I do think sooner or later, this kind of experimentation is going to get looked at again in architecture.
No.
But so we should open this up to questions from the audience.
I mean, didn't we feel like we were trying to improve on the work of Cabot?
Of course.
And improve the work of Kiesler. How often did we discuss these people? And so that will be returning. There must be cycles.
Well, it's a stone skipping, I think, always, in terms of there's a kind of stone skipping through history and a sort of amnesia between these blocks. Yeah. And it's generational. And I do think, that's what I'm saying, it could be the lull before the storm. I'm not one of those guys saying, oh, the new generation's not radical enough, or they're not, getting off. Yes, I am.
You just
and,
don't say. Well, you say they have three.
No, but it may be, I don't know. Our son is 17, maybe that generation or the one. But there is a kind of a groundswell. But you can feel kind of.
The students we are teaching go to SOM and shop or whatever.
No, the people we train go to SOM and shop.
Because they get better paid.
Yes.
I'm grateful.
Go ahead. There was a question. I think I saw a hesitant hand. Oh, there it is.
Hello. My name is Gregorio, and I have a weird question. So,
you got the perfect group for that.
What was the when you were young?
Talking about you.
When you were younger. students, what was going on? I mean, what kind of project, formally, I'm talking about the drawings of architecture were you doing? And what was the relation with, I think you were still studying, sorry for my poor English, architecture, but what was the relation with the group of Peter Eisenman, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and the magazine Oppositions that finished in '85, so you probably were not, but I don't know. And my question is also, don't you think there is a connection between what you did, because in the exhibit I see a lot of reflection of pure geometry, and the question of form in architecture, and in a way, the autonomy. I mean, I'm sorry to use this word, old word, but there is more connection between you and what Peter Eisenman did, and all this freedom from function.
Hey, you were with me then.
Then, I don't know if my question is clear, but...
No, well,
Peter who?
And I mean, because Gary, Bernard Tchoumi, and all them were part of this group that were trying to liberate the architecture from corporate functionalism, etc., and bring. I mean, now Peter Eisenman is studying Palladio and the architecture of Renaissance, which is geometry.
I know, for me, I was shocked and drawn to what you all were doing, but I saw it as not a purely formal and geometric research,
of course.
but the focus on kinesthetics and movement and experience, and the focus on media and image, it was fairly unprecedented. And I think it maybe, came from while you were students, or, maybe it actually just came from the milieu. I do think the connection with the art world,
Sure.
which we don't have time to talk about, but
very important.
the art world when we were young was really more of a dialogue. Like Frank Stella was using computer software and playing around with architecture, and Richard Serra was trying to figure out how to build torqued ellipses, and it was a fairly healthy exchange with art and architecture, which very rapidly turned into a very hostile relationship, where the sculptors were like, no, we're the ones that do the architecture without the toilets, and you're the ones that do the architecture with the toilets. And I mean,
They're the ones who get a lot of money.
And also, by the way, I'm selling this, and so could you do me a nice simple white barn, or white box? So, but the connection with the art world, I think, is not to be underestimated here, because I really do think that it's a very different world out there now. And, and also, by the way, the artists are running architecture practices, like Oliver.
Oh, yeah.
They've got 100 people doing CAD modeling and fabrication. And
That's our students.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, if you look at who we apprenticed under collectively, we were both at Eisenman's office at the same time, me very briefly. Greg was there a bit longer. I studied under Frank Gehry. Hani studied and then also interned under Daniel Libeskind and then collaborated with him. I'm sorry, Hani. But, he went to an art academy for graduate school.
He was very good in those years.
He was. But he went to an art academy for graduate school. I went to Yale when it was really the A&A. It was architecture and art, and there was half painting studios and half architecture studios. And I had fraternized much more with the artist side than the architect side. So, and then working with Frank Gehry, well, who was Frank Gehry influenced by? Frank Gehry himself was very influenced by the art world. So there is a lineage there.
Well, I'm going to tell the story. Lise-Anne's in a crit in your thesis year at Yale.
My final semester.
And her critics in front of her are Frank Gehry and Richard Serra, right? And they start having a fight. Turns out poor Lise-Anne's just standing there with her project, and she happened to introduce two curves on two cubes. And remember? And you wrote me this big
that's
letter.
early.
Yeah. And they really had an argument over curvature and form. And you remember
Not over the cubes.
Well, no, it was yeah.
That's not quite what the project looked like, but It was the beginning of a decades-long debate between Richard Serra and a very kind of hostile set of exchanges and Frank Gehry over art and architecture and what is not art and what
And
is
Annabelle
architecture.
just gave Richard Serra the
League Prize,
New York
right?
League Architecture Prize.
Yeah. So.
After somebody else couldn't come pick it up.
But I think that, maybe the kind of self-referential nature and autonomous nature of the work, I think our generation got there and felt it was kind of exhausted. Like we're definitely all individuals that want to have a unique and distinct voice and explore our own paths and, create something new and take risks and risk failure, but really embark upon architecture in a way to uncover new ways of creating environments and creating experience. And so for me, it was just like, it would have been unnatural to follow those footsteps even further, to kind of remain engaged in a kind of school of thought that was being perpetuated at the time. But definitely the influence was there. I think we all somehow were influenced by the Cooper Union
Yeah.
pedagogy, for instance, early on.